All right, so before I get started, just a quick show of hands. Who here uses multicast in their network in some way, shape, or form for some purpose? Yeah, besides OSPF. So that was a pretty good show of hands, probably a little more than half, I'd say. Now, who is doing Internet Multicast? You're connected to the global internet backbone, peering with other service providers, doing true over-the-top Internet Multicast. All right, very much lonelier crowd. And that's good, because it makes my next slide make sense. So overall, multicast has been a modest success for things like video distribution, MVPN, and especially financial networks. Multicast is an absolutely vital service. But these are all walled garden deployments. Internet multicast, on the other hand, deployment has been a lot more disappointing. Interest today is probably as low as it's ever been in Internet multicast. And yet perhaps the need is as high as it's ever been. And there have been certain hurdles and issues over the years that have prevented multicast from taking off. And the components to solve these problems have been built in and evolved so that a lot of these problems are solved. So I wanted to come here and bring some awareness. I'm going to focus on Internet multicast because it's much more interesting. It's much more sexy. It's much more potentially disruptive. And there was a lot of discussion on Monday about, the infrastructure isn't sexy enough, it's not cool enough, it's just plumbing. The first thing I'd point out is, without plumbing, people die in the streets of cholera. So plumbing's kind of important. But in terms of, to the point of, sexiness and making the network cool, I think multicast has a role to play here because it's making the network more intelligent, more efficient, and enabling some pretty disruptive things that could change the world. Also, you may already be using it now and not even realize it. So, what went wrong with Internet multicast? First, let's start with the status. So in terms of the global multicast-enabled Internet, I got these numbers a couple years ago, but I think they're still pretty accurate, or reasonably accurate. There's about 25,000 MBGP-enabled routes, about 450 ASs that are multicast-enabled. Now, that ain't nothing. If you were going to build a VPN or a network with 25,000 routes and 450 different ASNs, that would be a pretty impressive network. But the problem is, one of the necessities for Internet applications is ubiquity. Anything less than just about 100% deployment might as well not exist, because you end up with the chicken and egg scenario. There's no content because there's no audience. There's no audience because there's no content. So to understand this, how we got here and what the problem is, let's go back to the beginning. In the beginning, there was unicast. And if you had an interested receiver, the source would send him a stream. And if you have more receivers, the source sends a unique stream to each receiver. As you can see, this gets expensive for the source, who has to have a server powerful enough to send a unique stream to each receiver and enough bandwidth in the network. So along comes multicast. And the beauty of multicast is the network intelligently determines who are the interested receivers, builds a tree dynamically to each of those receivers, and delivers the content such that no data stream goes more than once over a given interface. But there's a problem. The internet is not one giant monolithic network. It's a network of networks. Some are multicast enabled, but most aren't. So if you have content on a multicast-enabled network and an interested receiver on a unicast-only network, the result is unbounded sadness. Sadness on the part of the receiver, who wishes he could get this content that's out there, and sadness on the part of the source, who has stuff that people are interested in that can't receive. And the reason for this is multicast requires every single layer 3 hop from source to receiver to be able to support multicast, to be multicast enabled. What that effectively means is every single router, every single firewall, and every single interface on every router and every firewall on the internet needs to have PIM enabled. And that's a really, really high bar. We've talked, Wes talked about it a little bit today. Getting everybody to deploy something everywhere is really, really, really difficult. And this is the all or nothing problem. You need it everywhere, otherwise it ain't gonna work. So what do? CDNs evolved and became popular. And the way CDNs work, this is kind of an oversimplified, there's various CDN models, but here's one. You deploy a bunch of CDN boxes in the network, you send a stream to one, he sends it to the other guys, and they each send the traffic on to their local receivers. The beautiful part about CDNs is it's almost as good as multicast, but it just works. It just works on the network, the internet that we have, not the internet that we wish we had or hope to have at some future. So if we compare these three models of unicast, multicast, and CDN, and we look at them, we look at cost as a function of audience size. As the audience grows, we see that unicast, it's obvious, it's a linear cost. You have 10 viewers, you need to send 10 streams. CDN, by comparison, has a per user cost as well. However, the slope of that line is much smaller. The per user cost is much lower. However, there is an initial cost. And that is the cost to deploy the CDN boxes. You have to have these boxes, stick them in a network, plug them into routers. So there's some small initial cost. And again, these graphs are oversimplified and more conceptual than anything. But if you look at this, CDNs work really well if your audience is large enough to make it worthwhile to have a CDN, but not too big, where the laws of large numbers take over, where you may have over 10 million simultaneous viewers, which isn't uncommon for a popular sitcom season finale. When you get to, or the Super Bowl, which has over 100 million viewers, when you get to certain numbers, sending a high-def stream to tens of millions of users becomes really, really expensive. Even with your CDN, it just becomes not very viable economically, or it's just really, really costly. Now, most people would say, you know what, this middle niche is pretty good. It covers most of the content out there, and I think the middle is where I would call it an area of convenience. It's old content in new places. Think, an episode of The Office on your laptop or your smartphone or your iPad. It's more convenient. And it seems really cool until at some point the novelty wears off and you're realizing you're just watching a sitcom rerun on a 4-inch screen, right? It's not really anything new, it's just old stuff in a new place. More convenient. The tails on, now if we look at multicast by comparison, and again, this is an oversimplified view from the perspective of the content owner. Whether you have one viewer or 1 billion viewers, the cost is the same. So multicast enables this full spectrum. It covers the full spectrum equally well, at least from the perspective of the content source. So multicast is able to address these tails, and the tails, it's not that in life you don't want to ignore the tails. The tails are where you find disruptors. First and foremost, on the left side tail, and that long tail content, there's a frictionless mobility to internet content, and that is if something strikes a chord, hits a nerve, it can go viral and very quickly go from niche content to mainstream, very quickly. And at the same time, again, on the other side, in the ultra-wide audiences, there's plenty of things, live linear TV is not dead. People still watch TV. There are certain things that people prefer to see live, sporting events, natural disasters, political speeches. So live linear streaming live linear video is never going to go away. So the tails are where you find your disruptors. Think new content from new contributors. In life, in general, you don't want to ignore the tails because the tails are where you find your black swans. So let's look at early examples of disruptive technologies. In 1991, the first 5 websites were Gophers had a search engine, and they had their own website. CERN had a few websites. The Digital Picture Archive at Delft University, I'm not even sure where that is. The Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. Pretty niche, esoteric content, kind of laughable by today's standards of content awesomeness. And yet this would evolve later into things like Amazon, eBay, Wikipedia, Google, and all the other websites that you're probably looking at right now. If you looked at the first webcam, it was a coffee pot cam at Cambridge, and yet this would evolve to things like Skype and YouTube. So you can imagine going back into the 90s and having a time travel vehicle, going back into the 90s and talking to some high-powered phone company executive and saying, you know what, someday you are going to spend billions of dollars. You're going to cut across people's driveways, tear through their lawns to deliver a tube of glass to their house so they can have fiber optic, high-speed access to this network. What he would probably say is, all right, cool, tell me about this network. Why would I spend billions of dollars on this network? And you say, well, it's got what's on this network right now? Well, there's the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, and there's a coffee pot can. You would have been laughed out of the office. They would have called security. So the lesson here is, don't judge a technology by the content that's available today, but rather what it makes possible. So let's do a thought experiment. Imagine we had a magic wand. And that magic wand could suddenly make the internet fully multicast enabled. What would become possible? So whenever I talk about multicast, people inevitably, and talk about content, people inevitably ask the same questions. Well, are you talking long-tail content, mid-tail content? Are you talking about head, popularity content? Is this HBO or the macrame channel? And the reason we do that is the prism through which we look at these things is in terms of business models. And the reason we look at that is we look at these things in terms of economics. And economics is about the allocation of scarce resources, which makes sense. In a world of scarcity, we have to think through the filter of different types of business models. However, in a world of abundance, I think a better model is an ecological model. And that is, if you have a rich set of ingredients environmental ingredients for life, what springs forth and what emerges is an abundance of life. You get many, many species evolve and co-evolve and emerge, and a diversity of these species that fits certain niches and enjoys specialized growth and success. I think this is a better model to think about when thinking about abundance. So what does this exactly mean? Well, multicast, since it's capable of supporting the full spectrum of content, whether it's 1 viewer or 1 billion viewers, it costs the same from the perspective of the source. It enables an abundance of content. And this springs forth new content from new contributors. So think the next generation of television. Today, television is a few hundred channels that fit through that wire that come to your house. And generally speaking, television, when we watch television, most of us, we're watching a completely separate network. And it effectively has no long tail. A long tail is tens of thousands. You only get maybe a few hundred channels. But think, in a world of abundance, think sporting events large and small. Imagine every single high school in the country broadcasting every single freshman JV and varsity game in high def. Grandparents could watch their grandchildren compete from thousands of miles away. Think large events. The Super Bowl I mentioned. Who would want to watch the Super Bowl over the internet? It's already free. It's over the air. Why would you want to do that? Well, in a world of abundance, you have more opportunities. There's more options. You can have things like the middle linebacker cam, or the sideline cam, or the locker room cam. Or you don't like the announcers, you can pick an alternative set of announcers to listen to. All these things become popular when you're not bounded by the scarce resources of that wire coming into your house, delivering your television content. Foreign content, imagine, if you've emigrated to this country and you want to learn what's going on in your native land, you may only have 1 or 2 channels on the current cable TV lineup to watch what's going on. And in a world where all you need is, say, $50 a month to send one high-def stream that can be reached by an arbitrarily large audience, that number can be thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. Think drones. Drones are becoming so cheap and ubiquitous. Hell, I'll send my drone over the stadium myself, and I'll broadcast video of what's going on at the game, and to an arbitrarily large audience. It brings to mind some very interesting copyright issues, but these things become technologically possible. Oh, I hit the wrong button. I hit the button I shouldn't have hit.
There's a button on the clicker that says blank, and if you hit the blank button,
yeah,
it really goes blank. Try hitting the blank button again.
Okay, but it's right where the next button ought to be. But okay, I'll hit the big green next button. So what's new? Internet Multicast has been around since the 90s. Didn't take off. It didn't happen, hasn't happened. Why should we believe it's going to happen? It never got traction before. Why should we believe it will now? And the answer is AMT. So there's a potential game changer out there, and AMT is that potential game changer. AMT stands for Automatic Multicast Tunnels, and it addresses the fundamental all-or-nothing problem. It solves the chicken and egg. It treats multicast deployment as a transition problem. So rather than trying to convince every service provider to turn on PIM on every single router and firewall on their network all across the internet, let's just dynamically tunnel end users on the unicast-only abyss to the multicast-enabled islands that do exist. And now, end users are no longer dependent upon their local service provider to receive multicast content. As the protocol was being developed, the requirements were, the set of requirements that we worked on were, it had to be simple. We didn't want grandma having to hack her kernel to get this to work. We didn't want her to have to configure routers. It had to be application and access agnostic. And the goal here is to enable content providers to enjoy the benefits of multicast. Otherwise, they're not going to be providing content for very long. We want to create an environment. We want to provide the raw materials, provide an ecosystem where we can enable an abundance of content. So, how does it work? Imagine a multicast-enabled service provider and a multicast-enabled content owner. And you have a multicast-enabled local service provider. And they do exist. There's not many of them, but they do exist. Now, you have a bunch of interested receivers in the local service provider, and they end up receiving multicast content natively as normal multicast works. Now we have the more common scenario of a unicast-only network on the left. And now you have a user on this network who is interested in receiving content. He sends his IGMP report to try to receive that content. His first hop router is not multicast-enabled, so that gets dropped. However, he has an AMT gateway client enabled, which is a thin piece of software, sitting on the host. And this probes the network to look for an AMT relay. An AMT relay sits at the border of the multicast-enabled network. And the way he finds the nearest relay is the relays use Anycast addressing. So he probes the network to see, is there any relays out there? The nearest relay replies back, here I am, here's my unicast address. And so he builds a UDP tunnel to that relay. Over that UDP tunnel, he sends an IGMP report. The relay receives that IGMP report, just like a normal multicast router, sends a PIM join on, receives the content natively, and then sends it through that UDP tunnel. As more receivers with gateway clients appear in that network, they each receive the content similarly, lather, rinse, repeat. And now that unicast-only local service provider finally has a reason to turn on multicast. Previously, it wasn't worth it. Why bother? There's no audience because there's no content. There's no content because there's no audience. Well, now that you have a bunch of duplicate unicast streams flowing across your network, now you finally have a reason to actually turn multicast on. So really what we're doing is we're providing a transition mechanism from unicast to multicast. And we're building dynamic tunnels, bringing them up, tearing them down to end hosts. Any application can sit on top of them. It's a thin client. And we learned our lesson from IPv3, where you needed an OS. You don't need an OS upgrade. It's as simple as a plugin. The reason we use UDP is because it's a little friendlier than say, GRE for NAT and firewall traversal. Also, again, we didn't want people to have to upgrade their OS. In terms of more details on the protocol, there's a three-way handshake between the gateway and relay to prevent spoofing and DOS attacks. The relay is the replication server. That's the one that sits at the boundary of the multicast-enabled network, and he joins the traffic natively and sends it on via unicast to the relays. Again, they use Anycast on the relays, and that's how you discover your nearest relay. If he blows up, you go to the next closest relay. The client, the gateway, can be either a host, it can be a PC, it can be a laptop, it can be a smartphone, iPad, or it can be the home gateway router, which is joining on behalf of multiple receivers sitting behind it. The beautiful thing is, if you've already turned on multicast, you have a native multicast-enabled network, which previously was generally not very useful. Now, with one line of config, approximately, on a peering router, you can enable AMT, and now your native multicast deployment can reach the entire internet. In terms of the spec, I've been going to IETFs for, going on about 14, 15 years now. I've never seen an effort at IETF with more cooperation from different vendors. So folks from Microsoft, Cisco, Alcatel, and Juniper have all contributed heavily. There's been others to the spec. But we all understand that we're all in the same boat here. This is the last best hope for Internet Multicast. We all want to see this succeed, and so it's been a very cooperative effort within the working group. This has been going on in the MBOND working group. The spec itself is currently at IESG, very close to crossing the goal line to publication. There were a couple items that came up during IETF last call, but they seem to be addressed, and we're ready to move on. So we're very close to advancing this to RFC, but more importantly, there's a number of implementations in existence and in the wild, and this has been deployed on the internet for a number of years. So as I look at multicast, I see a lot of similarities with V6. I think they're related, kind of technological cousins, in that any argument for or against V6 can be made just as easily for Internet Multicast. For example, there's plenty of people who say, we don't need V6. We've got CGN, we've got NAT, we've got CGNAT. You guys have been complaining that the sky's falling since the 90s. It hasn't fallen yet. Everything's just fine. We don't need it. They say the same thing about multicast. They say, you can do all this stuff with unicast. You can do this stuff today. We have CDNs. You really don't need this stuff. You've been talking about this stuff for years, and it hasn't happened. Conversely, the proponents will say you absolutely do need it. The V6 address exhaustion is real. It's happened. It's happening. You absolutely do need V6. It enables other things. It creates an abundance of address space, which enables all kinds of amazing things. Same thing for multicast. There is effectively no long tail for television. Effectively, television, the internet is well suited to support pretty much all traffic except television, live, multi-destinational content. And we absolutely do need multicast to address this missing long tail of television. Both suffer the same all or nothing problem. You need it on every single layer 3 hop in order to get it to work. Both require new protocols or extensions to old ones to get it to work. Both were born in the 90s and suffered through adolescence for relevance. I can remember, not long ago, a lot of people, had kind of given up on V6. It seems like V6 has turned the corner, and there's much more rational optimism for V6. It seems to be really happening now. Multicast isn't there yet, and the hope is that it can follow a similar track. Both also require a certain leap of faith, a faith in the unseen, a belief that, in and of itself, these things aren't that exciting, but what they enable is incredibly impactful. So in v6, I mean, let's face it, it's just a longer address, right? It's not doing anything fundamentally different. It's just a longer address. But that longer address enables all sorts of things. It creates a practically infinite address space, which creates an abundance of address space, which all kinds of things become possible that might not have been possible before. Same thing with multicast. You can do this stuff with unicast and brute force unicast. It costs something. But what multicast is really doing is creating an environment for an abundance of content, which will enable things that we can't imagine. So will it really happen? The internet has proven that once it has, over the years, one of the lessons we can learn from the internet is once the internet proves technically capable of supporting a certain medium, it becomes the dominant transport for that medium. And we've seen that with things like newspapers, magazines, music, books, pretty much everything except television. And television remains the one notable holdout. Everything else is pretty much on the internet except TV. And it seems inevitable that they eventually will truly merge. And by that I mean, the TV network that we generally receive will come over the internet, not, a separate network that most cable providers have. You can do it with brute force unicast, but it's just really, really, really expensive. Bandwidth is cheap and plentiful, but it's not free and it's not infinite. And really, AMT is the first step in this direction. It is the necessary first step that gets you there. AMT, it's unicast in the last mile, but it's multicast for the content provider, it's multicast for the transit provider, potentially. And it's the motivator for the downstream guys, for the last mile guys to turn on multicast. They finally have a real reason to do it. Also, it's happening today. So AT&T and Octoshape a couple years ago announced an Internet Multicast collaboration using AMT. The Eurovision Song Contest, which I'm told is very popular in Europe, has used multicast, AMT, and the French Open as well. CNN today, if you go to CNN and you look at their live video streams, you join them, you throw on Wireshark, you'll see it starts with unicast and then switches over to AMT multicast after about a minute or so. So, still not convinced? Or you are convinced, but you're not sure how you could ever convince your executives or product folks who may not have the same ability, vision, or ability to take a leap of faith. This is the one and only slide you need to show them, and I guarantee they will be convinced that multicast is the next big thing. AMT is a cloud-based, virtualizable, service chainable SDN solution. Don't don't take my word for it. Just ask Stan, the official unicorn of the SDN movement. So again, feel free to use this slide. I guarantee you it will work. You will get all the funding and resources you need to get multicast enabled. And we'll just keep it our secret. So what's next? We've been talking to the folks at the PAX, working on, the PAX used to be a very large, it was one of the primary peering points for multicast about 10 years ago. It's kind of fallen on hard times. We're working on reviving that, bringing it back to life, getting some public AMT relays deployed there. If you're interested in peering there, send me an email. Love to have you. If you yourself run a peering exchange and you want to get multicast up and running, let me know. We'd love to work with you. There's nothing stopping you. It's about getting awareness out. It's not very expensive. It's generally, somewhat free. World Multi, a couple years ago, I don't know if this was one of the tipping points. Maybe it was V4 exhaustion. Maybe it was World V6 Day. But it seemed like around that time, around World V6 Day, V6 began to get real traction. Maybe it's time for a World Multicast Day. Maybe, maybe not. Be interested in hearing from the V6 people how that went, if that helped. And any other ideas? Again, I'm here because most people have given up on multicast. They thought about it in the 90s. It was cool. It never happened. But it's the things that were preventing it. We've solved those problems. And I'm here to kind of let people know that it's time. It's ready. It's ready to rethink using multicast. So further reading, and with that, I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
Microphones are being charged. Here we go.
Bill Armstrong, Charter Communications. I'm interested to see if you guys have, I know it's kind of in its infancy, but have you guys talked to any gateway manufacturers, Netgears, folks like that, to see if there's something to get going there? I know
of, Cisco's been pretty active with AMT. And there was a lot of discussion about integrating that in the Linksys. I obviously don't know. I can't speak for Cisco, but I know that's been done. To be honest with you, it should be there. It's a thin, easy client. It was designed to be relatively simple to implement. So absolutely. One of the reasons I'm here is, we've been doing this work at IETF, and outside of that room, I don't think a lot of people know what's been going on with AMT, so it's tough to get the Netgear guys to show up at an MBOND working group meeting. We'd love to talk to them and tell others about it. So,
thank you.
Sure.
So just because of the timing right now, I'm going to basically close the microphones with who's up right now, or potentially on their way to the microphone, if anyone there is, and we'll go to Patrick.
Patrick Gilmore, Markley Group. One, I hope Multicast succeeds. Thank you for getting it. I hope Multicast succeeds. Thank you for trying it. But I worry that you're, first of all, in search of a problem, because assume grandma wants to watch the high school game. That's a single unicast stream because there ain't that many grandmas watching it. And so you're putting in a lot of time, effort to solve that problem. Secondly, believe it or not, as somebody who has streamed a shit ton of live video, trust me, there's not that much of it. There's a few times a year where it really matters that it's in that tail that you're talking about. The rest of the time, it really does work well on a CDN, and again, you're doing a lot of work for something that doesn't really work because people like their TiVo functionality, and the only other solution is to cache it at each end node, in which case the cost goes through the roof again. And finally, the most important thing, have you solved billing?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. 3 great questions. Hopefully I can remember them. So the
Oh,
first thing,
you
we
can
have an
just
aging
answer them.
population and way more grandmas than you think. The 90-year-olds are the fastest growing segment in the populace. But
God, that's true.
so yes, it's a high school freshman game or a high school varsity game may only have a handful of viewers, and you could do that with unicast, right? But what if you have the next LeBron James appears at that high school, and all of a sudden you have overnight, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people interested. Your point about it's not out there, I think that's kind of my point. Maybe it's not out there because
It's okay.
the environmental factors aren't there. And so if we create that environmental abundance and we make it easy, maybe more stuff will appear. And the other thing to keep in mind is it's not that difficult to turn on multicast. I've done it myself. I worked at a service provider. It's just another protocol to turn on your routers. There are enough people who have turned on multicast, that 25,000 and 450 ASs, that's possibly enough to get to critical mass if we get a few of them to turn on AMT. So the tough part is getting everybody to turn it on. And I can tell you, there are certain people who are never going to be convinced, and I've given up trying to talk to them. But there are others that say, yeah, multicast isn't that bad. I can turn it on, just, turn PIM on your interfaces. It's not that horrible. Doesn't really cost anything. It's just, it's just another protocol to enable on the router. And AMT, again, doesn't need hardware, depending on the implementation. We have an implementation, doesn't require any new hardware. You enable it with one line of config on a peering router, and it's out there. So if I'm wrong, and if this is a miserable failure, it didn't cost you much to turn it on. And what was your third question?
Billing, just
Billing.
is the most
Yes.
important thing.
So people who have tried to bill for multicast in the past have failed miserably. So I will save you the time. Don't bother trying. Think of it as like DNS or BGP. You know, we don't charge people to use your resolver, but it enables other things that are possible. Now,
You think they don't charge to watch the Super Bowl?
What's that?
You think they don't charge to watch the Super Bowl?
Well, you know, as a transit provider, it's going to be tough. Generally speaking, the content owner and the user, there's an opportunity for revenue there. But you know, the question is, how does the guy in the middle enjoy that revenue? Doing native multicast, if you turn native multicast on, I can almost guarantee you won't make money directly. You can't bill for it because nobody's going to pay for it, because in the past, there was no audience. You know, people who tried to deploy Internet Multicast, it failed miserably because there was no audience. So it's better to kind of offer it, you know, the better model is offer it for free, get people hooked on it, and figure out how to make money off it later. Now, AMT, on the other hand, you're actually doing something. You are providing off-net services. So, you know, maybe a simple business model is, hey, we've already deployed multicast natively across our backbone. We'll deliver it to our customers for free natively to our customers. But we will charge you on a per tunnel basis for AMT end users. That can be done. The billing's there, the accounting's there, and that's a real value. You know, if you look at it, it's pretty much just like a CDN, except it's multicast on one side and unicast on the back side. But what's different is it should be much, much cheaper because it's integrated into the routing infrastructure. You don't need a special box. You don't need to plug it into a router. It's inline in the packet forwarding engine. So it doesn't, so that the per user cost should be dramatically cheaper than, say, a CDN.
Adam Thompson, Manitoba Internet Exchange. I believe in most areas of North America, watching TV legally is, Netflix notwithstanding, pretty much a legally sanctioned duopoly. That certainly applies in Canada, where I'm from. What's to stop the network operators from deploying a rogue AMT relay node that serves no content?
So I would go back maybe 10 to 15 years and ask the same question of the recording industry, and what was to stop them, and they sort of did, but you know what? They had a duopoly or an oligopoly back then, and it didn't really work for them because eventually, once the technology proves it's capable and possible, you can't stop it, and that's one of the things about the internet. And what I would say is, people have asked a variant of this question is, well, if this becomes so popular, they'll just block this stuff. And my answer to that is, if the content has reached critical mass such that the big guys in black shiny shoes with suits on are blocking it, we've won. I will declare victory, and that is as great a success as you can possibly have if they start blocking it or trying to kill it. That means that it's reached a critical mass, and once it hits that critical mass, then you can't stop internet content. Like, life finds a way, as they said in Jurassic Park, content finds a way. Also, the Anycast, there is a global Anycast address, but I doubt it will get used because it's so easy to DOS, you know. So what's more likely is each provider will probably have their own Anycast address, and that protects you against the rogue DOS or unintentional hijacking of traffic.
So, Dave Temkin, Netflix, withstanding. I would actually say two things, and one popped into my head while you were speaking, answering Patrick's question, which is that you mentioned it's just another protocol to turn on. As someone who came from the financial world, I can assure you that just turning on multicast very regularly rebooted or did even more evil things to devices. So those of us who operate large networks know that you don't just turn on a feature and it just works, especially something that changes the hardware forwarding path of traffic. So I don't think it's fair to simplify it into that bucket that just turn on and works.
The same could be said of everything. Any line of
absolutely.
config you enter on your router runs the risk of doing that. It's all a cost-benefit analysis.
I completely agree with you, but you've now created a new chain in the code path that now has to be QA'd with every single change that you make to that router. So you've gone from just a pure packet forwarding engine to a packet replication engine, and you're completely changing the behavior of that device forevermore. Maybe that's okay, maybe it's not. The other point that I would make as well is that linear is dying. And so the idea that the next LeBron is going to show up at a high school and that everyone's going to want to watch that the second that that's on is going away. It was a problem, it has been a problem for the last 50 plus years at this point, but in reality, we're going away and we're going rapidly towards a time-shifted world, right? If you look at the statistics about how people use their DVRs at home and the proliferation of DVRs on cable networks, that just shows you that not only are we in a world where people are time-shifting traditional linear TV, but they're also, obviously by the fact I'm standing here, rapidly changing to over-the-top, even for things like broadcast networks and watching them in a non-linear fashion.
Right, so first, certain content, people generally speaking prefer live. Sporting events, natural disasters, political speeches.
I don't think people prefer natural disasters at all, but
It depends. I don't know. If you look at the ratings, they seem to spike. So live ain't dead yet. And another thing to keep in mind is, obviously, time-shifted video watching is growing, and it's becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. However, television has always been, for the past 70 to 80 years, the ultimate in a lean-back experience. Sometimes you get home from work one day, it's been a long day at work, you just want to fix yourself a drink, sit down in front of the couch and see what's on TV, and let the television wash over you. You don't want to go out actively and see what did I record, what on-demand movie is on. Sometimes you just want to go to CNN, ESPN, HBO, CNN, the Discovery Channel, and see what's on right now, and let it wash over me for about an hour or so until I can regain my senses and then wake up and start clicking around. And that's just because, you know, you can't beat out of people 70 years of passive
Sure.
Experience. Now,
if I could just say one thing to that.
If you think of time-shifted television, what is the most common use of time-shifted television? That is the personal DVR.
Yep.
Personal DVR is, I have this thing at home, my cable box, I tune into the stream, I receive it live linear, I record it, and I watch it because I'm not home and I don't feel like watching, or I don't feel like watching the commercials. I record it and I watch it later. That is a perfectly compatible model with multicast. You could say, I'm not going to be home at 8. I'm going to record this, I'm going to join this multicast group, receive the content, record it locally, and watch it locally. Multicast works perfectly in that model. So just between the live sporting events and those other things that are more linear friendly and the personal DVR model, that's a pretty rich target to cover.
Sure.
And I will say this, multicast is possible with on-demand. I don't have enough time, I'm actually a little bit over. I'd be happy to talk to anybody outside at the bar or anything. You can do on-demand with multicast. It is possible, it's been done. I'm a little skeptical as to how efficient it really is, but it is possible. I'd be happy to share,
Sure.
how it exactly works.
So
but
just-
even if I grant you the on-demand stuff isn't going to be covered, okay, do that unicast. There's still a rich enough set of stuff out there that exists and could exist, I believe.
I do understand your point, and I'll just leave as a parting thought two things as a response to you. One would be that the wash over you TV experience, that is going to go over the top. You're still going to be able to turn on your TV and just leave a random channel on, but that's going to be time shifted to you based on the preferences that you've put in. And it's probably not going to be Netflix doing it, but it's absolutely going to be someone else.
Well, and if it is that somebody else, there'll be a lot more someone else's if it's multicast.
True.
Because it becomes so much cheaper to do it over the top. And this is what it's all about. It's about over the top.
That's fair enough, but to that point, again, just to finish my point, which is that the idea that you're going to have a local DVR in 5 years is silly. Everyone's going towards cloud-based DVR. Again, multicast could be an interesting use case, but as someone who does do a large library of very random video. We've analyzed it to death, and multicast will not help. Thank you.
It'll be great to check back in 5 years and see if all this does or doesn't happen.
I'll be happy to be back in 5 years.
Lenny, thank you very much. This was a great discussion. Really appreciate it.